In a dusty roadside diner, I saw a young cop using his badge to bully an elderly woman over a spilled coffee. He didn't see the storm coming. Jax, a retired Navy SEAL, stood up with his German Shepherd Fenn by his side. It wasn't just a rescue, it was a collision of honor and ego. Little did Jax know, this woman held the key to the ghost that's been haunting his soul. I'm Wilder, and I've learned that nature and justice always find their way. Where are you listening from today? Tell me in the comments and subscribe for more stories of survival and connection. The morning in Seaside, Oregon didn't arrive with a sunrise. It arrived with a heavy, salt-laden mist that crawled off the Pacific and swallowed the town whole. It was the kind of gray that gets into your bones, a damp cold that makes the ancient hemlocks drip like they're weeping for things forgotten. The air tasted of brine and wet cedar, and the only light came from the flickering neon sign of the Rusty, Anchor, a diner that had seen better decades. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and griddle grease offered a sanctuary, or at least a place to hide, while the wind rattled the window panes like a restless ghost looking for a way in. In the farthest booth, tucked away where the shadows felt most secure, sat Jax Thorne. At 38, Jax didn't just occupy space, he seemed to endure it. He was a man built of hard angles and sudden silences, standing 6'2" with shoulders that still carried the invisible weight of a tactical vest he'd taken off months ago. His face was a map of places he'd rather not remember. A jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow, and his jaw was always set, as if he were bracing for an impact that was overdue. His hair, once a strict military buzz, had grown into a messy, dark mane, and his eyes were the color of the storm outside, a restless, turbulent flint gray. He was a retired Navy SEAL, but in this quiet town, he was just another veteran trying to outrun the echoes of gunfire in his head. Jax hadn't slept in 48 hours. The insomnia wasn't just tiredness, it was a physical ache, a buzzing beneath his skin that made his hands tremble ever so slightly. Between his scarred fingers, he held a tattered, cream-colored envelope. The edges were soft from being touched too many times, the ink of the address fading into a ghostly blue. It was a letter from a mother he had never met. The mother of Elias, the man who had stepped into a line of fire that was meant for Jax. He had carried that letter across 3 continents, but he still hadn't found the courage to break the seal. To open it was to admit that Elias was truly gone. Beneath the table, pressed firmly against Jax's heavy work boots, was Fenn. Fenn was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, a massive beast of 85 pounds, with a coat the color of autumn shadows, deep blacks and rich, burnt tans. He wasn't just a dog. He was Jax's tether to the world of the living. Fenn's ears were perpetually alert, and his eyes, amber and ancient, never left Jax for long. Sensing the spike of cortisol in his master's blood, the dog shifted, resting his heavy, warm head on Jax's knee. It was a silent communication, a grounding force that whispered, "I am here. You are safe. Breathe." The fragile peace of the diner shattered when the door kicked open, letting in a swirl of mist and a man who brought his own storm. Officer Miller walked in like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was barely 25, with a face that was still soft around the edges, but eyes that had already gone brittle with borrowed authority. He was tall and lean, his uniform pressed so sharply it looked uncomfortable, and his black duty belt creaked with the weight of tools he clearly hungered to use. Miller was the kind of man who confused fear with respect, a small-town boy who had been given a badge and a gun, and used them to fill the void where his character should have been. He didn't look for trouble. He manufactured it so he could feel like a hero for solving it. He strode toward the counter, his polished boots clicking loudly on the checkered linoleum. Near the middle of the diner stood Martha. At 60, Martha was a woman made of grace and faded denim. She was small, with silver hair tied back in a practical bun, and hands that showed the hard work of a lifetime spent in the coastal wind. She had a kindness in her eyes that usually acted as a balm to those around her, but today, her hands were shaking. She had been reaching for her sugar when she stumbled slightly on an uneven floorboard, and a few drops of her lukewarm black coffee had splashed onto the toe of Miller's pristine boot. "Are you kidding me?" Miller's voice cut through the low hum of the diner like a serrated blade. He didn't just speak, he projected, making sure every patron saw his grievance. Martha gasped, her face turning a pale shade of porcelain. "Oh, officer, I am so incredibly sorry. Let me get a napkin. You think a napkin fixes this?" Miller stepped into her personal space, looming over her until she was forced to lean back against the counter. "This is a department-issued uniform. This is government property. And you just assaulted an officer with a hazardous liquid." The diner went dead silent. The only sound was the sizzling of bacon on the grill and the heavy panting of Fen under Jax's table. Jax didn't move, but his gray eyes locked onto Miller. The envelope in his hand crumpled slightly. "It was an accident, young man," Martha said, her voice trembling but retaining a sliver of dignity. "Surely you can see that." "What I see," Miller sneered, his hand moving to rest on his hip, dangerously close to his handcuffs, "is a woman who's being non-compliant. Maybe you've had too much to drink this morning. Maybe I need to take you down to the station and run a sobriety test. Or maybe I just arrest you for disorderly conduct right now." Martha's eyes welled with tears. "Please, I'm just here for breakfast. I don't want any trouble." Miller leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, ugly whisper that still carried to the back booth. "Trouble is what happens when you don't show the proper respect to the law. Now, give me your ID, or you're going into the back of my cruiser in front of everyone." Jax felt the old fire stir in his gut. It was the same heat he felt when a mission went sideways, the sudden, cold clarity that comes when a predator encounters something it didn't expect. He looked down at the letter, Elias's mother's letter. Elias had died protecting a brother. And here, in the heart of a town that was supposed to be a refuge, a bully was attacking a mother who looked like she'd already lost enough. Fen stood up before Jax did. The dog didn't bark. He didn't have to. The low, guttural vibration that started in Fen's chest was enough to vibrate the salt shakers on the table. It was a sound of pure, concentrated warning. Jax let go of the envelope. He slid out of the booth with a fluid, predatory grace that belonged in a jungle, not a diner. He stood at his full height, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched Miller's boots. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer, looking at a boy who thought he was the center of it. The silence grew heavy, suffocating. The mist outside seemed to press even harder against the glass. Miller felt the shift in the room and turned, his bravado flickering for a fraction of a second as he took in the scarred, gray-eyed ghost standing before him. "This doesn't concern you, pal," Miller snapped, though his voice was an octave higher than before. Jax didn't blink. He just stared. And in that moment, the diner wasn't just a place for coffee anymore. It was a battlefield where the lines were finally being drawn. The air inside the rusty anchor grew so thin, it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out by a vacuum. Miller's hand was frozen an inch from his handcuffs, his fingers twitching with a nervous, unearned energy. He looked at Martha, whose small frame seemed to shrink under his gaze, and then he looked at the massive shadow looming over him. Jax didn't rush. He moved with the economical precision of a predator who knew exactly how much force was required to end a threat. His presence was a physical pressure, a cold front moving into the diner that made the back of Miller's neck prickle. "That's enough," Jax said. The words weren't shouted. They were delivered in a low, gravelly baritone that carried the absolute authority of a man used to being obeyed in the middle of chaos. "Step back. Now." Miller's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson, the heat rising from his starched collar to his ears. He was used to the quiet, hard-working folk of Seaside averting their eyes when he walked by. But this stranger looked at him as if he were a minor tactical nuisance. "You're interfering with a police investigation, pal," Miller spat, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his footing. He reached again for the cuffs, a desperate attempt to prove he was still in control of the room. Before his hand could even touch the leather pouch, a sound erupted from the floor that stopped his heart. Fen had moved. The German Shepherd didn't bark. A bark was a request for attention. Fen gave a low, chest-vibrating snarl that was a promise of violence. The dog's lips curled back just enough to reveal white, lethal canines. His body coiled like a high-tension spring. Fen wasn't just a dog in that moment. He was a weapon system locked onto a target, his amber eyes fixed on Miller's throat with terrifying focus. Miller recoiled so fast he nearly tripped over his own polished boots, his hand flying to the holster of his Glock in a blind panic. "Control your animal," he barked, his eyes darting between the dog and the man. Jax didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the gun. He stepped between Miller and Martha, shielding her with his broad frame. "My dog is controlled," Jax said, his flint gray eyes boring into Miller's. "The question is, are you? Because from where I'm standing, you're harassing a citizen over a splash of coffee. There are cameras in here, officer, and there are witnesses. You want to spend your morning explaining to the sheriff why you cuffed a grandmother for an accident? Or do you want to walk out that door while you still have a career?" The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of Miller's fading bravado. He looked around the diner. At the counter sat Sarah, the waitress, a woman in her late 40s with tired, kind eyes and hair the color of dishwater, who had seen enough bar fights to recognize a man who actually knew how to fight. She was already holding a landline phone, her finger hovering over the dial pad. Sarah was a woman of few words, hardened by a decade of raising 3 kids on tips alone, after her husband disappeared into the Pacific on a crabbing boat, and she had no love for bullies in uniform. Next to her was Old Man Henderson, a retired fisherman with skin like tanned leather and a grip like a vice, who was slowly standing up from his stool, his heavy flannel shirt straining at the shoulders. Miller realized he wasn't just facing Jax, he was losing the room. With a final jagged look of spite, Miller backed toward the door. "You think you're a hero?" Miller sneered, his hand trembling as he pointed a finger at Jax. "You're a drifter with an aggressive mutt. I know everyone in this town, and I've never seen you. You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Seaside is a small place, Thorne, if that's even your name. I'll make sure you regret the day you stepped foot in my jurisdiction." The bell above the door jangled violently as Miller stormed out into the mist, the tires of his cruiser screeching on the wet asphalt a second later. As the tension ebbed, Jax turned to the woman he had just protected. He expected to see terror, or perhaps the frantic gratitude of someone who had just escaped a cage. Instead, he found Martha staring at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She wasn't looking at his scars or his imposing height. She was looking directly into his gray eyes, her own hazel eyes shimmering with a mixture of profound grief and a startling, haunting recognition. She reached out a weathered hand, her fingers stopping just short of his arm. "Your eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "I've seen those eyes before, in the stories, and in the way he described the man who never left his side." Jax felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Oregon rain. The way she looked at him wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of a woman who had been staring at a photograph of him for a very long time. It was a gaze that was both painful and familiar, as if she were seeing a ghost through his skin. Jax stammered an excuse, his social muscles atrophied from years of isolation. He couldn't handle the weight of her stare, not while the letter from Elias's mother was still burning a hole in his pocket. He whistled softly to Fenn, who immediately broke his guard stance and returned to Jax's side, his tail giving a single, cautious wag. "You should get home, ma'am," Jax said, his voice tight. "He might come back." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and headed for the door, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He needed the cold air. He needed the mist to swallow him again before he broke apart. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, the atmosphere in the local police station was far from peaceful. Miller slammed his keys onto his desk, ignoring the curious look from the dispatcher, a young woman named Chloe, who was too busy with a crossword puzzle to care about his ego. He sat down at his computer, his breath coming in jagged hitches. He didn't pull up a ticket or a report. Instead, he opened the restricted law enforcement database. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the description of the man and the dog. "Jackson Thorne," he muttered, recalling the name Sarah had yelled out when she tried to calm the room. He began digging, bypassing the standard traffic records, and heading straight for the military archives and administrative filings. He wasn't looking for a crime, he was looking for a crack. He looked for expired tags, unregistered animals, or minor zoning violations on the cabin Jax was rumored to be renting out by the creek. He wanted to find a way to bleed the man through 1,000 paper cuts, administrative fines, leash law violations, anything that would allow him to use the weight of the law to crush the man who had made him feel small. As a photograph of a younger, more decorated Jax popped up on the screen, Miller's eyes narrowed. "Seal, huh?" he whispered to the glowing monitor. "Let's see how your training handles a mountain of lawsuits and a town that doesn't want you here." The walk from the rusty anchor to the edge of the residential district was a silent trek through a world painted in shades of charcoal and slate. Jax maintained a steady, rhythmic pace, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road, while Fenn trotted a few feet ahead, his nose twitching as he catalogued the scents of the coastal morning. Martha walked beside Jax, her breath hitching slightly in the cold air. She was small, but she carried herself with a quiet resilience that reminded Jax of the sturdy seagrass that clung to the dunes. Flexible enough to survive the gales, but rooted deep. As they turned onto a narrow, winding lane lined with salt-sprayed picket fences and overgrown hydrangeas, the mist began to thin, revealing a weathered cottage perched on a low rise overlooking the Pacific. Jax froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew this house. He had studied the grainy satellite images on his laptop for hundreds of sleepless nights in dark corners of the world. He knew the sagging porch, the peeling white paint, and the old wind chime made of driftwood that clattered softly in the breeze. This was the address etched into the back of his mind, the place he had spent 2 years gathering the courage to visit, only to stumble upon its owner in a roadside diner. "It's not much," Martha said, misinterpreting his sudden stillness as hesitation. "The salt air eats everything eventually, but it's home. Come in, Jax, please. I have a pot of tea that needs sharing, and I think your friend there could use a bowl of fresh water." She led him up the wooden steps, which groaned under Jax's weight. As she pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of lavender and old cedar wood drifted out to meet them. The interior was cozy, filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulates over decades. Hand-knitted throws, shelves of sea glass in mason jars, and walls covered in framed memories. Jax stepped into the living room, his gaze darting nervously around. He felt too large for the space, a creature of violence and shadows, invading a sanctuary of peace. He was about to make an excuse to leave, when his eyes locked onto a small mahogany shelf in the corner, illuminated by a single, flickering candle. There, resting in a silver frame, was a photograph of a young man in full desert camouflage, grinning at the camera with an arm thrown around a younger, less scarred version of Jax. It was Elias. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Jax's knees, usually as solid as granite, suddenly buckled. He didn't just sit, he collapsed onto the threadbare rug, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the edge of the shelf. The physical pain of his old injuries was nothing compared to the tidal wave of grief that crashed over him. He looked at Elias's face, the bright eyes, the stubborn chin, the look of a man who believed the world could be made right. He remembered the heat of that day in the valley, the smell of copper and dust, and the weight of Elias's body as he slumped against Jax, his last breath spent ensuring Jax had a chance to crawl to cover. "I'm sorry," Jax choked out, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. "I'm so sorry, Elias. I should have been the one." He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of 2 years of repressed agony. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a small, warm, and remarkably steady hand. Martha didn't pull away. She knelt beside him on the rug, her hazel eyes brimming with tears, but her face etched with a strange, maternal peace. She took his calloused hand in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I've been waiting for you for a very long time, Jax," she whispered. "Elias wrote about you in every letter. He said you were the brother he never had, the one who kept his heart from turning to stone. I knew you'd find your way here eventually." Mothers always know. While Jax struggled to regain his composure, Fen had been quietly exploring the room. The dog, usually on high alert, seemed strangely at ease in this house, as if the spirit of the place recognized him. Fen wandered toward a heavy, overstuffed armchair in the corner and ducked his head beneath the dusty lace trim of the slipcover. A moment later, he emerged, carrying a tattered blue rubber ball in his mouth. The ball was covered in old tooth marks and faded by time. Fen walked over to Jax and dropped the toy in his lap, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the floor. Jax looked down at the ball, and a fresh wave of memory hit him. He and Elias had spent hours in the dusty courtyards of their base, throwing a ball just like this one to pass the time between missions. They had sat on the edge of their cots, Elias carving scraps of driftwood, talking about their dream for the future. "A Seung Mok wood shop," Elias had said, his eyes shining. "Right there on the coast, Jax. We'll build chairs that don't break and tables that hold families together. You do the heavy lifting, I'll do the fine carving. We'll smell like sawdust instead of gunpowder." They had made a pact, a solemn promise between brothers in arms, to trade their rifles for chisels and build something beautiful out of the wreckage of their lives. Jax looked from the ball to Martha, and then to the photograph of his friend. The crushing weight of the debt he thought he owed Elias began to shift, transforming into something different. Not a burden of guilt, but a mantle of purpose. He looked at Martha's tired eyes and realized that Elias hadn't died just to save Jax. He had died so that Jax could take care of the home Elias had loved so much. The coastal wind outside picked up, rattling the driftwood chimes, and for the first time in 2 years, the buzzing beneath Jax's skin began to fade into a profound, albeit painful, stillness. He wasn't a drifter anymore. He was a man who had finally come home, even if the man who was supposed to be there with him was only present in the scent of cedar and the memories of a mother. The peace that had begun to settle over Martha's cottage was short-lived, shattered by the grinding of heavy diesel engines and the strobing orange lights of municipal trucks. Jax was out on the porch before the first vehicle even came to a full stop, his hand instinctively resting on Fen's head. 3 trucks, bearing the Seaside Public Works insignia, rumbled into the small gravel lot adjacent to the old workshop, a sturdy, barn-like structure of silvered cedar, where Elias's father had once crafted the finest cabinetry in the county. Miller stepped out of his cruiser, his uniform looking even more restrictive in the harsh light of a cloudy morning. He wasn't alone. Accompanying him was a man named Silas Vance, a corporate surveyor for Vanguard Development. Vance was a man who looked like he was made of expensive wool and cold calculations, standing tall and skeletal, with a sharp aquiline nose and eyes that peered through frameless spectacles with the clinical indifference of a vulture. Vance didn't care about the salt air or the history of the shop. He held a digital tablet like a scepter, his long, pale fingers tapping against the screen as he pointed toward the workshop's foundation. "What is this, Miller?" Jax's voice was like grinding stones, cutting through the mechanical hum. He watched as two workers began unloading heavy timber beams and yellow caution tape, moving toward the shop's double doors. Miller didn't look at Jax directly. Instead, he puffed out his chest, hiding behind a thick stack of laminated papers. "Official notice of zoning violation and immediate seizure for public safety, Thorne," Miller declared, his voice bolstered by the presence of the corporate surveyor. "This structure hasn't been inspected in a decade. The foundation is encroaching on protected wetlands, and according to the new municipal code, it's a fire hazard. We're sealing it off. No one goes in, no one comes out, and effective immediately, this property is under review for eminent domain." Martha stepped out onto the porch, her face pale as she saw the workers slamming a heavy steel bar across the doors Elias had built with his own hands. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice thin with disbelief. "This shop has been here for 50 years. Miller finally looked up, a cruel smirk dancing on his thin lips. 50 years of neglect, ma'am. Vanguard has a project for this coastline, an underground utility hub that serves the whole county. Your little hobby shop is in the way of progress. You've got 48 hours to vacate the cottage before we start the formal eviction." Jax didn't move to fight them physically. He knew that was the reaction Miller wanted. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as he watched the interaction between Miller and Vance. He noticed the way Miller's hand lingered near his pocket after Vance handed him a small, heavy envelope, and the way the surveyor nodded with a secretive, predatory satisfaction. The seal in Jax, the part of him that was trained to read the terrain for hidden traps, saw the truth instantly. This wasn't about safety or wetlands. This was a land grab, fueled by grease and backroom deals. As the trucks finally pulled away, leaving the workshop sealed behind yellow tape and steel, Jax didn't go inside to comfort Martha. He turned to Fen, whose ears were flat against his head, his tail tucked low in a sign of intense agitation. "They think they're the only ones who can play dirty," Jax whispered, his voice a low vibration that only the dog could hear. That night the cottage was filled with a different kind of silence, a tactical silence. Jax moved with the soundless fluidity of a shadow, his dark, tactical clothing blending into the gloom of the living room. While Martha slept fitfully in her room, Jax was at work. He hadn't just been sitting on the porch, he had been observing. During the day, he had noticed Miller lingering near the perimeter of the house, ostensibly checking the property lines. Using a handheld frequency scanner he'd kept from his service days, Jax began to sweep the room. Fen acted as his second set of eyes, his nose working overtime. The dog stopped near a small, hand-carved wooden birdhouse Elias had made as a child, which sat on the windowsill. Fen let out a sharp, quiet huff, nudging the base of the birdhouse with his wet nose. Jax reached out, his fingers tracing the wood until he felt a tiny, unnatural protrusion. With a pair of needle-nose pliers, he extracted a miniature high-gain microphone, a listening device. Miller wasn't just trying to evict them. He was hunting for anything he could use to bury Jax legally before the eviction deadline. "Good boy, Fen," Jax murmured, pocketing the bug. He didn't disable the others he found, one behind the picture of Elias, another under the porch railing. He wanted Miller to hear exactly what Jax wanted him to hear. Leaving Fen to guard Martha, Jax slipped out into the misty night, heading toward the Vanguard Development mobile office parked 2 miles down the coast. Using his skills in covert reconnaissance, he bypassed the perimeter fence as if it were made of paper. He didn't need to break in, he just needed to observe. Through the window of the main trailer, he saw Miller and Silas Vance sitting together, a bottle of expensive bourbon between them. Spread out on the table were architectural blueprints, but it wasn't a utility hub. It was a luxury subterranean resort, a bunker for the elite. And scrawled in the corner of a ledger were Miller's initials next to a series of 5-figure sums. Jax adjusted his thermal binoculars, capturing the scene with a digital recorder. He watched as Miller laughed, the young cop's face twisted with a greed that made him look older and uglier. Jax felt a cold, sharp focus return to his mind, the same focus he had felt during night raids in the mountains. Miller had set a snare, but he had forgotten that he was hunting a man who had been trained by the best to turn the hunter into the prey. As Jax crawled back through the seagrass, Fen met him at the edge of the property, a silent sentinel in the dark. The battle for Seaside had begun, and for the first time, Jax felt like he was fighting for something that was worth the cost of the scars. The Pacific Northwest sky didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a deep, sickly violet before the heavens finally tore open. By midnight, the rain wasn't falling in drops but in sheets of liquid lead, driven by a gale that shrieked through the hemlocks and sent the ocean roiling against the cliffs of Seaside. The coastal road, a narrow strip of asphalt carved between the mountains and the sea, had become a treacherous river of mud and debris. Inside the cottage, the driftwood chimes were no longer clattering, they were screaming in the wind. Jax stood by the window, his silhouette illuminated by the frequent, jagged pulses of lightning. He had spent the last hour watching the road through thermal optics, waiting for a movement he knew was coming. Miller, panicked by the realization that his bugs were being monitored and his secrets were no longer safe, had chosen the cover of the storm to flee. A mile down the road, a pair of headlights flickered weakly against the deluge. Miller's cruiser was moving too fast for the conditions, fishtailing as it hit patches of standing water. In the passenger seat sat a briefcase stuffed with the evidence of his betrayal. The ledgers, the envelopes of cash, and the signed agreements with Vanguard Development. Miller was a man driven by a singular, frantic instinct: survival. But the land he had tried to exploit had other plans. As the cruiser rounded the sharp bend near Dead Man's Point, the saturated hillside finally gave way. A massive slide of mud and ancient timber slammed into the side of the car, spinning it like a toy. The cruiser flipped, rolling twice before coming to rest upside down at the very edge of a crumbling embankment that dropped 50 feet into a surging, storm-swollen ravine. Jax saw the flash of the crash and didn't hesitate. "Fen, with me!" he barked, grabbing a coil of climbing rope and a heavy-duty tactical flashlight. He didn't ask himself why he was running toward the man who had tried to destroy him. In the world of the SEALs, the mission was the only thing that mattered, and right now, the mission was a life in peril. They reached the crash site just as the cruiser began to groan, its weight shifting toward the abyss. Mud was pouring into the broken windows, and through the shattered glass, Jax could see Miller, bloody, dazed, and pinned by the steering column. The young cop was no longer a bully. He was a terrified child, his eyes wide and white in the darkness as the water rose around his chest. "Help me!" Miller choked out, the arrogance stripped from his voice. The ground beneath the car was liquefying. Jax anchored the rope to a sturdy hemlock and rappelled down the slick slope. The rain was so deafening it felt like a physical weight. "Don't move, Miller!" Jax shouted over the roar of the gale. As he reached the car, the embankment shuddered. A large section of the road collapsed, taking the front half of the cruiser with it. Miller screamed as he was jerked toward the void. Jax lunged, grabbing Miller's arm, but the mud was too slick, the weight too great. "Fen, now!" The German Shepherd didn't hesitate. Fen launched himself into the churning mud and rising water, his powerful limbs driving him toward the wreckage. He didn't just bite, he calculated. Fen dove into the cab, his jaws locking onto the thick, reinforced leather of Miller's duty belt. The dog braced his front paws against what remained of the doorframe, his neck muscles bulging with a strength that defied his size. With Jax pulling from above and Fen anchoring him from below, they managed to keep Miller from being swept into the ravine as the car finally slid away, vanishing into the darkness below. For 10 agonizing minutes they fought the earth itself, Fen refusing to let go of the belt, even as the mud threatened to bury him. Slowly, inch by inch, Jax dragged the gasping, broken officer up the slope to the safety of the pavement. While the life and death struggle unfolded on the cliffside, a different kind of battle was being won in the quiet of the cottage. Martha sat at Elias's old workbench, the glow of a battery-powered lantern illuminating her determined face. She wasn't cowering from the storm. In her hand was a vintage long-range base station radio, a relic Elias's father had used to communicate with the fishing fleet. She tuned the dial with a steady hand, bypassing the local police frequencies Miller had compromised. "Seaside base to Eagle 1, come in, Silas," she said into the receiver. On the other end, miles away in the county seat, Sheriff Silas Big Bear Boone sat up in his chair. Boone was a man who looked like he had been carved out of an oak stump, 70 years old, broad-shouldered, with a white beard that reached his chest, and a reputation for honesty that was as legendary as his temper. He had been a brother-in-arms to Martha's late husband, and a mentor to Elias. He hadn't heard Martha's voice on the radio in years, and the urgency in it made him reach for his Stetson immediately. "Martha, is that you? What's going on in the mist, lady?" Boone's deep, gravelly voice crackled through the static. Martha didn't waste time. She laid out the evidence Jax had gathered, the bugs, the Vanguard blueprints, the bribe ledgers Miller had left behind in his haste, and the location of the secret meetings. "Silas," My boy died for this country, and now a coward with a badge is trying to sell his memory for a resort. Jackson Thorne is out there in the mud, trying to save that coward's life right now. I need the law to show up, Silas, the real law." "I'm coming, Martha," Boone replied, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low rumble. "Tell that SEAL to keep his head down. The cavalry is on the way." As Martha clicked off the radio, she looked at the photograph of Elias. The storm was still raging, but for the first time in a long time, the house felt like it belonged to her again. She had played her part, using the connections of the past to protect the future Jax was fighting for in the rain. The storm did not vanish all at once. It exhaled, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean, though scarred by the passage of the winds. As the first pale light of a Tuesday morning filtered through the salt-crusted windows of the county courthouse, the weight of the law finally descended on Miller. He appeared in the dock with his arm in a sling and his face a map of bruises, the arrogance that had once defined him replaced by a hollow, flickering fear. Sheriff Silas Big Bear Boone stood at the back of the room, his presence alone enough to keep the air heavy with the gravity of justice. The evidence Martha and Jax had provided, the digital recordings, the bribe ledgers, and the illegal surveillance devices, was an avalanche Miller couldn't outrun. By noon, he was stripped of his badge and his state certification, his career ending not with a bang, but with the cold click of the very handcuffs he had once threatened to use on a grandmother. Silas Vance and the Vanguard Development Group didn't fare much better. The luxury bunker project was halted indefinitely as a federal investigation into land fraud and municipal bribery began to ripple through the state capitol. In the weeks that followed, the yellow caution tape was stripped away from the old workshop by Jax's own hands. The steel bars were removed, and the smell of cedar and pine once again filled the air, replacing the stagnant scent of neglect. Jax didn't leave Seaside. The restless buzzing beneath his skin, the ghost static of his past, had finally quieted into a steady, purposeful hum. He moved into the small room above the workshop, dedicating his mornings to repairing the roof and his afternoons to the fine art of woodworking Elias had so often described. He wasn't just building furniture, he was building a sanctuary. He took on the role of a son in all the ways that mattered, checking the shingles on Martha's roof before every rain, carrying the heavy groceries from the market, and sitting on the porch with her in the evenings as the fog rolled in. Martha, in turn, found a new vitality. The grief that had bowed her shoulders for 2 years hadn't disappeared, but it had found a companion in Jax, and together, they carried the memory of Elias like a shared light rather than a crushing burden. Fenn, too, seemed to have found his true territory. The German Shepherd no longer paced the perimeter with the frantic edge of a soldier in a combat zone. He spent his days draped across the sawdust-covered floor of the workshop, his amber eyes watching Jax move from the lathe to the workbench. Occasionally, a new visitor would stop by. Sarah, the waitress from the diner, who often brought a tin of her famous cinnamon rolls, or Old Man Henderson, who would lean against the doorframe and offer gruff, expert advice on which local woods resisted the salt rot best. The town, once suspicious of the scarred stranger and his formidable dog, had begun to tilt toward them with a quiet, respectful warmth. They saw the way Jax cared for Martha, and they understood that the drifter was, in fact, the most rooted man among them. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the Pacific in strokes of liquid gold and bruised amber, Jax, Martha, and Fenn made their way down to the shoreline. The air was crisp, smelling of cold salt and the sweet, resinous scent of the hemlocks. They sat together on a massive piece of bleached driftwood that had washed up during the storm, a natural bench smoothed by the tide. Fenn lay at their feet, his chin resting on Jax's boot, his tail moving in a slow, contented sweep across the sand. Jax reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out the cream-colored envelope. It was no longer a weight, it was just paper. With a steady hand, he finally broke the seal. He expected pages of questions, or perhaps a long recount of Elias's childhood. Instead, there was only a single, sturdy piece of parchment, in a handwriting that was elegant yet firm, the same handwriting he saw every day in Martha's kitchen, were 7 words that changed the course of his life. "Live for the both of you, son." Jax closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the scar on his eyebrow. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He wasn't a man living on borrowed time. He was a man who had been given a command, the most important mission of his life, and he was finally fulfilling it. "He knew," Jax whispered, handing the note to Martha. She read it, a soft smile touching her lips as she leaned her head against Jax's shoulder. "He always knew you were the one who could carry it, Jax." As the last sliver of the sun vanished beneath the waves, a young woman walked along the tide line. It was Chloe, the dispatcher from the station, who had witnessed Miller's downfall. She was tall and athletic, with wind-tousled blonde hair and a bright, inquisitive expression. She had always liked Fen from afar, and as she drew closer, she slowed her pace. She caught Jax's eye and gave a small, genuine smile, a greeting that held no suspicion, only a quiet acknowledgement of the new life he had built. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" she called out, her voice carrying over the sound of the surf. "The best," Jax replied, his voice clear and grounded. Chloe nodded, her gaze lingering on Fen for a moment, before she continued her walk down the beach, her silhouette disappearing into the growing twilight. It was a small moment, an ordinary encounter, but to Jax, it felt like a door opening. The story of Elias's sacrifice hadn't ended in a valley in a far-off land. It had transformed into a legacy of wood, salt, and a mother's love. As the stars began to pierce the darkening sky above Seaside, Jax stood up, whistled for Fen, and turned back toward the cottage on the hill. He had work to do tomorrow, a Seung Moke to run, and a family to protect. For the first time in his life, Jax Thorne wasn't looking for a way out. He was exactly where he was meant to be. This story of Jax and Fen is more than just a tale of a soldier and his dog. It is a testament to the invisible threads that bind us all. Here is the final lesson and a message for our daily lives. The journey of Jax and Fen reminds us that our past burdens do not have to be a life sentence. Sometimes, the very things we are running away from are the things that lead us to where we are meant to be. Jax thought he was hiding from the world, but in truth, he was being guided toward a mother who needed a son and a home that needed a protector. In our everyday lives, we often carry our own unopened letters, regrets, grief, or fears that we are afraid to face. We might feel like drifters, even in our own towns. But just like Fen, who found a forgotten toy and brought it back to the light, life has a way of showing us that nothing is truly lost. Compassion is the greatest bridge. It can turn a stranger into a brother and a broken house into a sanctuary. Be the person who stands up when others look away. Be the friend who stays when the storm hits. And remember, sometimes the best way to heal your own heart is to help mend someone else's. I want to thank you for being here and for listening to this story of survival and connection. It means the world to me. Where are you watching from today? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Does Jax's journey remind you of someone in your life? I would love to read your stories. If this story touched your soul, please hit the like button, share it with a friend who might need a little hope, and subscribe to the channel to join our community. May God bless every one of you watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, and guide your steps with peace and courage in the days ahead. If you feel the spirit of this story in your heart, please comment Amen below. Amen.